This tiny puppy thinks the bobcat is his mum and gives her more than love. But what begins as a strange and heartwarming bond quickly spirals into danger. A helpless pup follows a deadly predator into the wild, while powerful forces close in, determined to destroy them both. Every step he takes pulls the people around him into a fight they never saw coming. Because this bobcat isn't just a mother. She's the key to a secret that could shatter everything. Will loyalty and love be enough to survive what's waiting in the shadows? Or will this unlikely family be torn apart before the truth comes to light? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The morning mist clung to the Appalachian foothills like a thin wool blanket, turning the world outside Clara Donnelly's veterinary clinic into a tableau of soft grays and muted greens. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her weathered hands, watching the familiar scene with tired eyes. The sunrise painted streaks of pink across the sky, but Clara barely noticed the beauty anymore. These days, running her struggling clinic left little room for appreciating nature's daily show. A sharp whimper cut through the morning quiet. Clara froze, her coffee halfway to her lips. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere near her back door. Setting down her mug, she hurried outside, her practical boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Hello," she called softly, scanning the area. There, huddled against the clinic's back wall, was a tiny bundle of dirty white fur. A puppy, so small and frail it looked more like a stuffed toy than a living creature. Its ribs showed through matted fur, and its eyes, when they met hers, were huge and desperate. "Oh, you poor little thing," Clara whispered, her heart squeezing. She approached slowly, years of veterinary experience guiding her movements. The puppy didn't flinch or try to run. It just watched her with those enormous eyes, trembling slightly in the morning chill. Kneeling beside it, Clara could see it was seriously undernourished. "Someone just dumped you here, didn't they?" she murmured, carefully scooping up the fragile body. The puppy felt like nothing in her arms, lighter than her medical bag. It snuggled against her chest, seeking warmth. Inside the clinic, Clara performed a thorough examination. The puppy was male, probably around 8 weeks old and severely underweight. No collar, no microchip, no signs of where he might have come from. "Well," she said, stroking his head gently. "Looks like you're staying with me for now." As she worked through her morning appointments, vaccinating Mrs. Henderson's cats, checking Farmer Brown's livestock, Clara kept the puppy in a warm, blanket-lined crate in her office. He accepted the food and water she offered, but something about his behavior struck her as odd. He seemed distracted, constantly alert, his attention fixed on something beyond the clinic walls. That afternoon, while cleaning up after a particularly messy emergency involving a goat with an upset stomach, Clara heard it, a low, rumbling growl from outside. She knew that sound. The local bobcat, a female she'd spotted several times in the past few months, prowling the edge of the woods behind her clinic. The puppy's reaction was immediate and unexpected. He scrambled to his feet, pressing his tiny nose against the office window, his whole body trembling with excitement. Clara watched, amazed, as he tracked the bobcat's movement across the yard with an intensity that seemed almost maternal. "Hey now," she said softly, moving to block his view. "That's not something you want to get mixed up with." But the puppy whined and ducked around her, his focus unwavering. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged that both fascinated and worried Clara. The bobcat appeared regularly, hunting in the tall grass that bordered the woods, and each time The puppy would become absolutely fixated. He'd press against whatever window offered the best view, making small sounds that weren't quite barks, more like the mewling of a cat. One morning, Clara was organizing supplies in the treatment room when she heard the scrape of claws against the floor. She turned to find the puppy had somehow managed to squeeze through a gap in the office door. Before she could react, he darted past her legs and through the clinic's partially open back door. "No!" Clara called, running after him. Her heart pounded as she burst outside, expecting the worst. But what she saw stopped her in her tracks. The bobcat stood at the edge of the woods, powerful and wild, her tawny fur catching the morning light. The puppy had stopped about 20 feet away from her, his tiny tail wagging tentatively. Clara held her breath, ready to dive forward and snatch him to safety. But the bobcat didn't attack. She watched the puppy with piercing amber eyes, her head tilted slightly. The puppy took a few steps forward, that strange mewling sound coming from his throat again. To Clara's astonishment, the bobcat remained still, showing neither aggression nor fear. "This is impossible," Clara whispered to herself, not daring to move. The scene before her defied everything she knew about wild predators and domestic animals. Yet there it was, this tiny, abandoned puppy, somehow forming a connection with one of nature's most efficient hunters. The bobcat finally turned away, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. The puppy sat down, watching the spot where she'd vanished, until Clara finally found her voice. "Come here, little one," she called gently. To her relief, he trotted back to her, seemingly satisfied with the encounter. That evening, as Clara sat in her favorite chair with the puppy dozing in her lap, she reflected on the strange events of the day. Her life had fallen into such a predictable pattern after losing her husband. Wake up, care for animals, sleep, repeat. The loneliness had become as much a part of her daily routine as checking inventory or filling prescriptions. But now, watching this tiny creature sleep, occasionally twitching as he dreamed, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Wonder. The puppy's unlikely fixation with the bobcat had awakened something in her, a reminder that the world still held mysteries and unexpected moments of connection. "What am I going to do with you?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. The puppy stirred slightly but didn't wake. Outside, through her living room window, Clara could see the woods where the bobcat roamed. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and for the first time in years she found herself truly appreciating the beauty of the moment. She knew she should be worried about this unusual behavior, should probably try to discourage the puppy's fascination with the wild predator. But something about the gentle way the bobcat had regarded the puppy, and the pure, unconditional trust in the puppy's approach, touched something deep in Clara's heart. Perhaps sometimes the most unlikely connections were exactly what we needed to shake us out of our solitude. The puppy sighed in his sleep, and Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of his small body against her leg. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for now, she was content to share in this small miracle. This reminder that life still held the capacity to surprise and delight, even in the quiet corners of her world. A sharp whimper cut through the morning stillness. Clara set her coffee mug down with a gentle clink and hurried to her back door. There, huddled against the weathered steps, was the smallest puppy she had ever seen in her 15 years as a veterinarian. His mismatched paws, one brown, three white, trembled as he looked up at her, with eyes full of both fear and hope. "Well, hello there, little one," Clara said softly, crouching down. The puppy's ribs showed through his thin coat, telling a story of neglect that made her heart ache. As she reached out slowly, a movement at the edge of the woods caught her attention. There, partially hidden in the undergrowth, stood a magnificent bobcat, its tawny fur blending with the morning shadows. Clara froze, her hand mid-reach. The wild cat's amber eyes locked with hers for a breathtaking moment before it melted back into the forest. To her amazement, the puppy let out another whimper, not of fear, but of longing, as he watched the bobcat disappear. "You're an odd little fellow, aren't you?" Clara scooped up the trembling pup, who squirmed in her arms, trying to keep his eyes on the spot where the bobcat had vanished. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed. I think I'll call you Tobin." Over the next few days, Clara discovered just how unusual her new charge was. Tobin wolfed down the puppy food she offered and accepted her gentle care, but his attention remained fixed on the woods. He would sit for hours by the clinic's fence, nose pointed towards the forest, waiting. It wasn't until Clara spotted him actually following the bobcat one afternoon that she understood. "Tobin, get back here!" she called out, her heart racing as she watched the tiny pup trotting after the wild predator. To her astonishment, the bobcat turned and waited, showing no aggression. Tobin wiggled with joy, bouncing around the large cat's paws, while the bobcat watched with what Clara could only describe as maternal patience. "This isn't natural," Clara muttered to herself, running her fingers through her greying hair. He's going to get himself killed. But day after day, the strange relationship continued. The bobcat would appear at the edge of the woods, and Tobin would race to greet her like a long-lost mother. Clara was treating a farmer's injured cow one morning when she first heard the whispers about Rex Holloway's campaign against the bobcat. The farmer's wife, Mary Beth, leaned against the barn door, her face pinched with worry. "That Holloway's on the warpath," Mary Beth said, shaking her head. "Lost some of his precious game birds to a bobcat, and now he's determined to hunt it down, offering a reward and everything." Clara's hand stilled on the cow's leg. "A bobcat? Where?" "Near your place, actually. Says it's been spotted around his new hunting preserve. You know, that land he's clearing out past your clinic." Mary Beth's voice dropped. "Though between you and me, I heard he didn't get proper permits for that development." Clara's stomach tightened. She knew Rex Holloway by reputation, a man who treated the county like his personal kingdom, using his wealth and influence to bend rules and people to his will. The thought of him targeting the bobcat, Tobin's strange adopted mother, filled her with dread. "It'll probably move on," Clara said, trying to convince herself as much as Mary Beth. Bobcats usually do when there's too much human activity. But as she drove home that afternoon, Clara saw the bright orange hunting notices tacked to trees along the road. Each one bore Rex Holloway's name and a substantial reward for the bobcat's death. Through her windshield, she caught sight of Tobin sitting at the edge of her property, faithful as always, waiting for his wild friend. Back at the clinic, Clara watched Tobin's daily routine with growing unease. The puppy had begun to fill out under her care, but he remained small for his age, his devotion to the bobcat unwavering. She found herself checking the woods more frequently, straining to hear gunshots, her heart jumping at every unexpected sound. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, Clara sat on her back steps with Tobin in her lap. The puppy's ears perked up, and she followed his gaze to see the bobcat emerging from the shadows. In the fading light, Clara could see the wild cat's sleek form clearly, and noticed for the first time the slightly swollen appearance of her belly. "She's expecting," Clara whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. No wonder she's been hunting closer to the settlements. Tobin squirmed free from her lap, rushing to greet his unusual friend. The bobcat waited patiently for his approach, showing none of the aggression Clara would expect from a pregnant wild animal. The sound of a truck engine rumbling down the nearby dirt road made both Clara and the bobcat tense. The wildcat disappeared into the woods, Tobin whining at her departure. Clara scooped him up, holding him close as Rex Holloway's expensive pickup rolled past her property line, rifle rack clearly visible in the back window. "This isn't going to resolve itself, is it, little one?" Clara murmured to Tobin, who continued to stare at the woods with devoted eyes. The puppy's small body trembled against her chest, and Clara felt her own resolve beginning to strengthen. She had tried to stay neutral, to believe that nature would take its course, but watching Tobin's unwavering loyalty to the bobcat stirred something in her that had been dormant since her husband's death, a fierce need to protect, to stand up against the casual cruelty of powerful men like Rex Holloway. Mary Beth's words about the questionable permits for Rex's new hunting preserve echoed in her mind. Clara stood up, still holding Tobin, and walked to her office. She had contacts in the county planning office, people who might be interested in taking a closer look at Rex Holloway's activities. If the bobcat couldn't survive by avoiding human attention, perhaps it was time for Clara to draw some attention of her own. The sun had fully set now, and the woods beyond her clinic were dark and full of secrets. Somewhere out there, a pregnant bobcat was preparing a den for her kittens, while one of the county's most powerful men plotted her destruction. And here, in Clara's arms, a tiny puppy's heart beat steadily against her chest, his unlikely love for the wild cat forcing her to choose a side in the coming conflict. Clara watched from her back porch as Tobin scampered towards the tree line, his small frame dwarfed by the towering oaks and maples. Her heart clenched every time he disappeared into the underbrush, following the invisible trail of his unlikely maternal figure. "Tobin, come back here," she called out, but the puppy only glanced back briefly before continuing his determined trek. The bobcat had become more than just a fascination for him. It was an obsession that grew stronger with each passing day. Inside her modest clinic, Clara picked up the phone for what felt like the 100th time that week. "Hello, Sarah." "It's Clara Donnelly again." She twisted the cord around her finger as she spoke to her closest neighbor. "I was wondering if you'd consider signing that petition about the bobcat situation." A heavy sigh crackled through the line. "Clara, honey, I know you mean well, but Rex Holloway isn't going to change his mind because of some signatures on a piece of paper. Those game birds cost him thousands of dollars each." "But the bobcat has kittens to feed," Clara protested, thinking of the den she'd glimpsed deep in the woods. "It's just doing what comes naturally." "Nature or not, Rex won't stand for anything threatening his investments. You know how he is." Clara did know. Rex Holloway's influence stretched across 3 counties, his wealth and connections making him practically untouchable. She'd seen his sleek, black SUV cruising past her property twice already this week, his men making no secret of their surveillance. After hanging up, Clara drove into town, a stack of petitions tucked under her arm. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed open the door, greeting old Mr. Peterson behind the counter. "Morning, Clara," he said warmly. Then his face fell as he spotted the papers in her hand. "Oh, now, don't tell me those are about the bobcat." "They are," she admitted, setting them on the counter. "Would you consider posting one by the register?" Mr. Peterson's weathered hands smoothed over the petition, his expression troubled. "You're swimming against the tide here, Clara. Rex has already got the hunting permits in order. Says it's a matter of protecting local businesses." "His business, you mean?" Clara corrected, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "What about the natural balance of things? That bobcat keeps the rabbit population in check, which helps all the local farmers. Folks around here don't want to get on Rex's bad side." Mr. Peterson said gently, sliding the petition back to her. "Maybe you shouldn't either." Throughout the day, Clara visited other businesses in town, but the response was always the same: sympathetic looks followed by careful refusals. By afternoon, she sat in her truck, watching Rex's men walk the perimeter of her property, with their high-powered rifles slung across their backs. Back home, she found Tobin had returned from another of his woodland excursions, leaves stuck in his fur and mud on his paws. He bounded up to her with his usual enthusiasm, but Clara noticed he was venturing further and staying away longer each time. That evening, as Clara prepared Tobin's dinner, she heard the distinctive rumble of Rex's SUV passing by again, slower this time. Through her kitchen window, she could see men with flashlights sweeping the tree line, their beams cutting through the gathering dusk. "What are we going to do, little one?" she murmured to Tobin, who was wolfing down his food. "Nobody wants to stand up to Rex, and I can't blame them, but somebody has to do something." The puppy finished his meal and trotted to the back door, scratching at it insistently. Clara's stomach twisted with worry as she let him out, watching him disappear into the deepening shadows. She knew the Bobcat was out there somewhere, likely hunting for her own young, while Rex's men drew ever closer to discovering her den. Each passing day brought more signs of Rex's determination. His men became bolder, venturing deeper into the woods behind Clara's clinic. She found boot prints in places where she'd never seen them before, and the local hunting supply store suddenly had a fresh stock of heavy-duty traps. Clara tried reasoning with Rex's foreman, Mike, when she spotted him measuring distances near her property line. "The Bobcat's not just some nuisance animal," she argued. "She's a mother protecting her young. Surely there's a better way to handle this." Mike barely glanced at her as he made notes in a small notebook. "Mr. Holloway's made up his mind, Ma'am. Best stay clear of this whole business." That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by unsigned petitions and unanswered emails to wildlife conservation groups. Tobin lay at her feet, unusually still, as if sensing her distress. The sound of an owl's call drifted through the open window, followed by the distant crack of a branch. Rex's men, no doubt, still searching in the darkness. She thought about the Bobcat, how it moved with such grace and purpose, how it had somehow formed this inexplicable bond with Tobin. The puppy had grown stronger under her care, but his heart clearly belonged to the woods and its wild inhabitant. Every time he returned from one of his adventures, his tail wagging and eyes bright with excitement, Clara felt a mix of relief and dread, knowing that each day brought Rex closer to his goal. The locals' refusal to help, while frustrating, was understandable. Rex Holloway's influence touched everything in their small community, from jobs to loans to property values. Standing against him meant risking more than just disapproval. It meant potentially losing livelihoods and homes. Clara gathered her failed petitions into a neat stack, tucking them away in a drawer. The weight of her powerlessness settled heavy on her shoulders as she watched Tobin sleep, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Tomorrow, she knew, he would again race into the woods, drawn by a connection she couldn't fully understand, but felt compelled to protect. Outside, another flashlight beam swept across her yard, reminding her that time was running out. Rex's determination to eliminate what he saw as a threat to his business interests wouldn't be swayed by one small-town veterinarian's concerns. The imbalance of power was stark and undeniable, leaving Clara feeling as though she were trying to stop an avalanche with bare hands. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear, frost glittering on the browning grass around Clara's clinic. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her hands as she watched Tobin's daily routine unfold. The small puppy bounded through the yard, his mismatched paws leaving tiny prints in the frost as he followed his usual path toward the woods. "Be careful out there, little one," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Tobin. Something felt different about this morning, a heaviness in the air that made her stomach knot with worry. She had just turned away from the window when a high-pitched yelp pierced the morning quiet. The sound sent her coffee mug crashing to the floor, forgotten as she bolted for the door. "Tobin!" Clara's voice cracked with panic as she ran towards the tree line. The puppy's cries grew more desperate, leading her deeper into the woods. She crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping at her face, until she found him. The sight stopped her cold. Tobin lay trapped in a cruel steel device, its metal teeth clamped around his small leg. Blood matted his fur, and his eyes were wide with terror and pain. The trap, clearly meant for the bobcat, had snapped shut on her precious puppy instead. "Oh God, oh God!" Clara repeated, dropping to her knees beside him. Tobin whimpered, trying to lick her hand even in his agony. The steel jaws of the trap were buried deep, and Clara's hands shook as she examined the mechanism. She knew these types of traps. They were brutal things designed to hold large predators. Her veterinary training told her exactly how much damage they could do, and panic clawed at her chest as she realized Tobin's delicate bones could be crushed beyond repair. "Hold still, baby," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady as she searched for the trap's release mechanism. The metal was slick with morning dew, and Tobin's blood making her fingers slip. Each failed attempt brought another whimper from the puppy, driving daggers into her heart. A shadow fell across them, and Clara's head snapped up to see the bobcat standing 20 feet away. The wild cat's amber eyes fixed on the scene, tail twitching. For a moment, Clara feared the predator might see Tobin as easy prey, but something in its gaze seemed almost concerned. "Please," Clara whispered to no one in particular, returning to her desperate work on the trap. Her fingers were bleeding now from the sharp edges, but she barely noticed. Finally, she found the right pressure point and threw her whole weight against the spring mechanism. The trap's jaws creaked open with an awful sound, and Clara quickly but gently pulled Tobin's leg free. The puppy collapsed into her arms, shaking violently. She cradled him close, checking the damage through tears of relief and rage. The leg was mangled, but not completely crushed. With proper care, he might recover fully. But the sight of his injury, the knowledge that it could have been so much worse, ignited something fierce in Clara's chest. This trap had been set by Rex's men, she was certain of it. They were getting bolder, placing their cruel devices closer and closer to her property. If Tobin had been just a bit bigger, or if the trap had caught him differently, the bobcat was still watching them, and Clara found herself meeting its steady gaze. "This has to stop," she said aloud, her voice firm despite her tears. "They won't get away with this." Carefully wrapping Tobin in her jacket, Clara stood on shaking legs. The bobcat melted back into the forest as she turned toward her clinic, each step strengthening her resolve. This wasn't just about protecting wildlife anymore. Rex Holloway had brought the fight to her doorstep, and he'd hurt one of her own. Back in her clinic, Clara worked methodically to clean and treat Tobin's wound, her medical training taking over. The puppy remained brave throughout, only whimpering softly when she had to manipulate the injured leg. She took x-rays, cleaned and stitched the deep cuts, and carefully bandaged the leg. "You're going to be okay," she promised Tobin, who looked up at her with complete trust despite his ordeal. "And I'm going to make sure this never happens again, to you or to anyone else." As she settled Tobin into a recovery bed, Clara's mind was already racing with plans. She'd been too passive, too willing to believe that simple petitions and neighborly appeals would be enough. Rex Holloway had shown his true colors. He didn't care who got hurt in his vendetta against the bobcat. She looked out her clinic window toward the woods where the bobcat had stood, witness to the morning's events. Somewhere out there, the wild cat was still roaming, still at risk from more of Rex's traps. The thought of finding her the same way she'd found Tobin made Clara's jaw clench. This was no longer about one woman's quiet resistance to local authority. Rex had made it personal, and Clara would meet that challenge head-on. She wouldn't let fear of his influence or power stop her anymore. The trap that had caught Tobin had also sprung something in Clara, a fierce determination that would not be denied. Tobin dozed fitfully in his bed, his injured leg carefully elevated. Clara sat beside him, gently stroking his fur, her mind already formulating her next moves. The time for polite petitions was over. She would fight for Tobin, for the Bobcat, and for what was right, no matter the cost. Clara sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of land records and property maps she'd borrowed from the county clerk's office. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she traced boundary lines with her finger, comparing official documents to more recent surveys. Something wasn't adding up. "This can't be right," she muttered, reaching for her third cup of coffee. The steam fogged her glasses as she took a sip, her eyes never leaving the papers spread before her. According to the original deed records from 20 years ago, Rex Holloway's hunting preserve covered 800 acres, but the newer property tax assessments showed nearly 1,200 acres under his name. The difference wasn't just a simple measurement error. It was 400 acres of land that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. Clara pulled out her laptop and opened the State Forestry Service website. After some digging, she found what she was looking for, a map of protected forest land in their county. Her heart started beating faster as she overlaid it with Rex's property boundaries. "Got you," she whispered, sitting up straighter. The extra acreage Rex claimed matched perfectly with a section of protected forest that was supposed to be under state management. He had somehow managed to incorporate state land into his private hunting grounds without anyone noticing. The sound of scratching at the back door interrupted her concentration. Tobin stood there, his tail wagging hopefully. His leg was still wrapped in a bandage from the trap incident, but he was healing well. "Come here, boy," Clara called, opening the door. The puppy limped over to her, nuzzling her hand. "You know what this means, don't you?" That trap wasn't just set on Rex's land, it was placed on protected state property. She returned to her research with renewed determination. Over the next few hours, she discovered more irregularities, property line adjustments that had never been properly recorded, permits issued without proper environmental impact studies, tax payments that didn't match the claimed acreage. Clara started making phone calls, first to the county assessor's office, then to the State Forestry Service. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. Rex had been quietly expanding his territory for years, using his influence to push through paperwork without proper oversight. "Yes, I understand this is a serious accusation," Clara said into the phone, speaking with a state forest ranger. "But I have documentation showing at least 400 acres of protected land being used as private hunting grounds. There are steel traps being set in areas where they're completely illegal." The ranger's response was cautious but interested. He promised to look into it and asked Clara to email her findings. As evening approached, Clara sat back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The scope of Rex's deception was bigger than she'd imagined. This wasn't just about one Bobcat anymore. It was about years of systematic abuse of power and environmental regulations. She glanced at Tobin, who had fallen asleep under her table. "We've got to do something about this," she said softly. "But it's going to take more than just us." Clara spent the next day organizing her evidence. She created a detailed timeline of Rex's land acquisitions, noting each instance where boundaries had been quietly shifted or permits had been rushed through without proper review. She gathered satellite images showing the expansion of his hunting areas into protected forest land. The more she dug, the more she found. Rex had been counting on nobody paying attention, on everyone assuming he had the right to do whatever he wanted with his land. But Clara had proof now, proof that much of what he claimed wasn't legally his at all. She knew exposing him wouldn't be easy. Rex had friends in high places and deep pockets to fight any challenges, but Clara also knew she couldn't stay quiet. This wasn't just about protecting one wild animal anymore. It was about standing up to corruption that affected their entire community. If we can prove he's been setting traps on state land, she explained to Tobin, who watched her with attentive eyes, that's a federal offense. And if we can show he's been fraudulently claiming protected forest as his property, that opens up a whole other set of legal issues. Clara started reaching out to local environmental groups, sharing her findings carefully. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in land use cases, sending copies of the most damaging documents. With each step, she felt the weight of what she was undertaking, but also the rightness of it. The evidence was clear. Rex Holloway had built his hunting empire partly on stolen land, counting on his money and influence to keep anyone from looking too closely. But he hadn't counted on a determined veterinarian with a wounded puppy and a stack of property records. Clara created multiple copies of all her documentation, storing them in different locations. She knew that once she went public with this information, Rex would try to discredit her or pressure her into silence. But she had something he didn't expect: the truth, backed up by official records and satellite imagery. Looking out her window at the forest beyond her clinic, Clara felt a mix of determination and apprehension. Somewhere out there, the Bobcat was still roaming, unknowingly at the center of a much larger conflict. And now Clara had the means to protect not just one animal, but hundreds of acres of wildlife habitat that should never have been turned into a private hunting ground. "We're going to need help," she told Tobin, who pressed against her leg supportively. "But first, we need to make sure every piece of evidence is absolutely solid. Because once we start this fight, Rex isn't going to back down easily." She spent one more evening double-checking every detail, making sure there were no holes in her documentation that Rex's lawyers could exploit. The story was there in black and white. Years of quiet land grabs, unauthorized expansion, and environmental violations, all hidden behind Rex's reputation as a powerful local businessman. Clara knew that exposing Rex's fraudulent land expansion would change everything, not just for the Bobcat, but for the entire community. It was no longer about saving one animal, it was about confronting years of corruption and standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Clara's discovery of Rex's land fraud left her feeling both energized and overwhelmed. She knew she needed help, but finding allies willing to stand against Rex Holloway wouldn't be easy. Her thoughts turned to Harlan Pierce, the former game warden who'd left his position under mysterious circumstances 3 years ago. She found Harlan's cabin tucked away in the deeper woods, almost hidden beneath towering oak trees. The weathered structure looked like it had grown straight from the forest floor. As Clara pulled up in her truck, she noticed the meticulously maintained garden beds that contrasted with the cabin's rough exterior. Harlan emerged onto his porch before she could knock, his lined face as weathered as his cabin's walls. "Doc Donnelly," he said gruffly, adjusting his worn denim jacket. "Figured you might show up eventually." "Mr. Pierce." Clara nodded. "I need your help." "This about Rex's Bobcat hunt?" Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Or something bigger?" Clara held up her folder of documents. "Both, actually. I've found some irregularities in his land holdings. 400 acres of state-protected forest that he's somehow claiming as his own." Something flickered in Harlan's expression. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the cabin was sparse but orderly, with topographical maps covering one entire wall. A collection of wildlife photographs suggested a man who'd never really left his calling behind. "I knew," Harlan said quietly, settling into a worn armchair. "Knew something wasn't right with those property lines. Started looking into it back when I was warden. Next thing I knew, pressure came down from above. Found myself pushed into early retirement." Clara leaned forward. "Then you understand what we're up against. Rex isn't just after one Bobcat. He's been stealing public land piece by piece." "We?" Harlan raised an eyebrow. "You're planning to take him on?" "I have to." Clara explained about Tobin, the trap incident, and her growing certainty that Rex's influence needed to be challenged. As she spoke, she saw the old warden's demeanor slowly shift. "Been a long time since anyone's had the guts to stand up to him," Harlan finally said. He walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "These are my own records from when I was investigating. Never could prove anything concrete, but maybe together." Their planning session was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming outside. Clara looked out the window to see her niece June stepping out of a beaten-up Volkswagen, her purple-streaked hair bright against the forest backdrop. "What's she doing here?" Clara wondered aloud, then remembered. She'd mentioned to her sister that she might be visiting Harlan today. June must have overheard. The teenager burst through the door without knocking. "You're really going to do it?" she demanded. "You're really going to take on Rex, Holloway? June, this isn't—" Clara began. "I want in," June interrupted. "I've seen what he does to this land. My friends and I used to hike these trails before he started claiming them as private property. Now there's no trespassing signs everywhere." Clara and Harlan exchanged looks. June's passion was evident, and despite her youth, she knew the local teenagers' hiking paths better than anyone. Plus, having a tech-savvy teenager on their side could prove invaluable. "All right," Clara said slowly. "But we do this carefully. We need concrete evidence." Over the next few hours, the unlikely trio developed their strategy. Harlan would use his knowledge of the land and wildlife patterns to help protect the Bobcat's den. June would document trail closures and new boundary markers with her phone's GPS, building a map of Rex's gradual encroachment. Clara would continue gathering legal documents and building a case. "We'll need proof of active wildlife on the protected land," Harlan explained, pointing to locations on his maps. "Trail cameras here, here, and here, not just for the Bobcat. We need to show this is vital habitat being destroyed." June pulled out her laptop. "I can set up a secure cloud drive for all our evidence, and I know exactly where to put those cameras. There's an old game trail that Rex's men don't know about." Clara watched them work, feeling a surge of hope. June's fingers flew across her keyboard while Harlan marked critical points on his maps. The generation gap between them seemed to vanish as they focused on their shared mission. "We'll need to move fast," Harlan warned. "Rex's men have been getting more aggressive with their trapping. That Bobcat's got kits to protect. She'll be more visible, more vulnerable." "Then we start tonight," Clara decided. "June, can't you help Harlan set up those trail cameras? I'll begin organizing the documentation we have so far." As they finalized their plans, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: the strength that comes from not standing alone. She watched June and Harlan discuss camera placements, the retired warden's gruff manner softening as he explained tracking techniques to the eager teenager. That evening, as they prepared to implement the first phase of their plan, Clara caught June looking at her with newfound respect. The distance that had grown between them since Clara's husband died seemed to be closing. "Aunt Clara," June said quietly as they packed supplies, "I'm sorry I've been so distant. After Uncle Jack died, it hurt too much to come around. But watching you stand up to Rex, trying to protect this land and that Bobcat, it reminds me of all the reasons I used to love visiting here." Clara pulled her niece into a tight hug, surprising them both. "We're going to need that passion of yours, June. All of it." As darkness fell, their small resistance movement began to take shape. Harlan led them through the deepening shadows, teaching them to move quietly through the underbrush. June documented boundary markers with her phone's camera, while Clara kept watch. Together, they placed the first set of trail cameras in strategic locations around the contested land. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they finished their work and prepared to separate for the night, Clara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since starting her campaign to protect the Bobcat. With Harlan's expertise and June's determination added to her own resolve, they had a real chance of exposing Rex's corruption and protecting both the land and its inhabitants. Clara's kitchen window offered a clear view of the morning mist rising from the valley. She stood there, coffee mug warming her hands, watching Tobin's familiar routine. The small pup trotted purposefully towards the tree line, his mismatched paws carrying him with determination toward where the Bobcat usually appeared. "Be careful out there, little one," she whispered, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The sharp crack of a truck door slamming made her jump. Through the window, she spotted two of Rex's men walking along her property line, their rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. One of them, a heavy-set man she recognized as Mike Denton, deliberately caught her eye and smirked before hammering a "no trespassing" sign into a tree on her side of the boundary. Clara's hands tightened around her mug. The message was clear. Rex knew she was gathering evidence against him. Her phone buzzed. It was Harlan Pierce, his gruff voice tight with concern. "Clara, they're setting up new trap lines. Found 3 this morning, all closer to your clinic than before." "How close?" "Too close. Within 50 yards of where you usually walk, Tobin. They're getting bold." Clara's stomach clenched. "I'll call June. We need to document everything." June arrived 20 minutes later, her camera bag slung over one shoulder. The teenager's usual sullen expression had been replaced by fierce determination. "Uncle Rex thinks he owns everything and everyone," she said, checking her camera settings. "Mum says I should stay out of it, but she doesn't understand." They spent the morning photographing the new traps and marking their GPS coordinates. June's hands were steady as she captured images of the steel jaws, partially hidden under leaves. "These are different from the hunting traps," she noted. "They're meant to intimidate." A sharp bark drew their attention. Tobin stood at the edge of the clearing, his tail wagging as he watched something in the shadows. The Bobcat emerged silently, her powerful form moving like liquid gold through the underbrush. But something was different today. Her movements were more cautious, her path more circuitous. "Look!" June whispered, raising her camera. "She's nursing!" Clara watched in amazement as the wildcat paused, turning to reveal her swollen teats. She has kittens somewhere nearby. The realization hit her like a physical blow. No wonder the Bobcat had been more territorial lately. She wasn't just hunting for herself anymore. Tobin whined softly, taking a few steps toward the Bobcat. The large cat regarded him with familiar tolerance, then disappeared into the brush. The pup started to follow but stopped at Clara's sharp whistle. "Good boy," she called. "Come back here." Later that afternoon, Clara met with Harlan in his cabin to review their evidence. The retired game warden's walls were covered with maps of the area, red markers indicating Rex's illegal expansion into protected lands. "We've got something solid," Harlan said, spreading out June's photos alongside property documents. "But Rex isn't going to back down easily. He's already trying to pressure the county commissioners." A truck engine roared outside, too close for comfort. They looked up to see one of Rex's vehicles crawling past the cabin, moving deliberately slow. The driver's face was hidden behind dark glasses, but his message was clear. "They're watching us," Clara said quietly. "Let them watch." Harlan growled. "We've got copies of everything in 3 different locations now. Even if they try something, they can't stop all of us." That evening, Clara received an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a veterinary clinic that had burned down 2 counties over, with the words, "Accidents happen," scrawled across it in red ink. She called June immediately. "We need to move faster. Can you get those photos to your contact at the newspaper tonight?" "Already done," June replied. And I uploaded everything to a cloud drive. They can't destroy what they can't find. Clara was checking the clinic's security system when she heard Tobin's urgent barking from the back door. She found him agitated, pacing and whining. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of ATVs. Rex's men were running night patrols now, trying to locate the Bobcat's den. They won't find her, Clara promised Tobin, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. We'll make sure of that. The next morning brought a small victory. June's newspaper contact had published a story about suspicious land deals in the county, carefully worded but pointed enough to draw attention. Rex's men suddenly withdrew from their most obvious positions, clearly trying to avoid scrutiny, but Clara knew better than to celebrate. As she watched Tobin following the Bobcat's trail again, she could feel the pressure building. The wildcat had kittens to protect now, and Rex would only get more desperate as his illegal activities came to light. She gathered her allies for an emergency meeting. June brought aerial photographs showing the actual boundaries of the protected forest. Harlan contributed his detailed knowledge of the terrain and wildlife patterns. Together, they mapped out a strategy to monitor the most likely den locations without drawing attention to them. We're not just protecting one animal anymore, Clara told them, watching Tobin's small form disappear into the trees after his unlikely guardian. We're fighting for something bigger, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. The Bobcat appeared briefly at the forest's edge, her powerful form a reminder of everything wild and free that Rex threatened. She looked directly at Clara, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. They were both fighting to protect what they loved, and neither could afford to lose. The morning dawned blood-red, an ominous harbinger that made Clara's skin prickle with unease. The air felt wrong, too dry, too still. Tobin paced restlessly at her feet as she stood on her back porch, his usual eagerness to chase after the Bobcat replaced by nervous whining. Something's not right, Clara muttered, scanning the tree line. That's when she caught the first whiff of smoke. Her phone buzzed, June's name flashing on the screen. Clara, Rex's men, they're setting fires along the eastern ridge. June's voice crackled with panic. They're trying to smoke out the Bobcat. Clara's heart lurched. Where are you? I was photographing their illegal traps when I saw them. I'm about half a mile into the woods near Thompson's Creek. Stay put. I'm coming to get you. Clara grabbed her emergency kit and whistled for Tobin. And June! Call Harlan. Tell him to alert the fire department. The smoke was thickening rapidly as Clara and Tobin entered the forest. The morning's unusual stillness had given way to a hot wind that drove the flames faster than anyone could have predicted. Rex hadn't counted on the tinder-dry conditions after weeks without rain. They found June crouched behind a fallen log, her camera clutched to her chest. They brought hounds. She coughed. I saw them release them just before they started the fires. A distant baying confirmed June's words, the sound carrying even over the growing roar of flames. Clara grabbed June's arm. We need to get out of here now! But as they turned to retrace their steps, a wall of orange flame cut across their path. The fire was moving too fast, surrounding them on multiple sides. Clara's veterinary training kicked in. Animals trapped by fire would seek water. Thompson's Creek! She shouted over the inferno's growing roar. It's our best chance! They ran, ducking under smoke-filled branches, while burning debris rained down around them. Tobin stayed close to Clara's heels, his usual confidence shaken by the chaos. The creek seemed impossibly far as the air grew thicker with smoke and ash. A massive oak, its trunk eaten through by flame, crashed down barely feet from where they stood. June screamed as burning splinters scattered around them. Clara pulled her niece closer, trying to shield her from the worst of the heat. Keep moving, Clara urged, but another falling branch forced them to veer away from their planned route. The smoke was so thick now that Clara could barely see June beside her, let alone their destination. A new sound cut through the fire's roar, the closer baying of Rex's hounds. They were being driven straight toward the dogs, Clara realized with horror. Tobin growled, pressing against her leg. Through the smoky haze, Clara caught glimpses of movement, powerful shapes closing in. The hounds had found them. She could make out at least 3 of them, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "Up there!" June pointed to a rocky outcrop. "We might get above the smoke." They scrambled up the steep incline, loose rocks sliding under their feet. The hounds followed, their pursuit made easier by 4-legged stability. Clara felt Tobin trembling against her as they reached the top, trapped between the approaching flames and the snarling dogs. The largest hound lunged forward. Clara instinctively threw herself over Tobin, expecting to feel teeth tear into her back. Instead, she heard a savage screech that definitely didn't come from any dog. The bobcat launched herself from a nearby ledge, her powerful body slamming into the lead hound. The dog yelped in shock and pain as razor-sharp claws raked across its face. The other hounds hesitated, caught between their training to pursue and their instinct to flee from the fury of the wild cat. The bobcat stood her ground between the hounds and Clara's group, her fur bristling, making her appear twice her size. She screamed again, a sound that raised the hair on Clara's neck, and the hounds broke, turning tail and fleeing back through the smoke. "Oh my God," June whispered, her camera forgotten in her hands. But they weren't safe yet. The fire was still advancing, and now Clara could see why the bobcat had chosen this moment to appear. Above them, partially hidden by an overhanging rock, was the entrance to a den. The wildcat looked directly at Clara, then at Tobin, who had stopped trembling and was watching his surrogate mother with complete trust. In that moment, Clara understood. "Follow her," Clara said, pulling June up. "She knows a way out." The bobcat led them along a narrow ridge, staying just visible through the smoke. Where the humans had to climb carefully, she moved with fluid grace, occasionally pausing to ensure they kept up. Tobin stuck close to Clara, but kept his eyes fixed on the bobcat, as though drawing courage from her presence. They descended into what seemed like a natural gully, the air gradually clearing as they moved away from the main body of the fire. Clara could hear the welcome sound of running water getting closer. Finally, they emerged at a bend in Thompson's Creek, where the banks rose high and rocky on both sides, a natural fire break. The bobcat paused at the water's edge, turning to face them one last time. In the distance, sirens announced the approaching fire trucks. "Thank you," Clara said softly, knowing how inadequate the words were. The wildcat's ear twitched, and then she was gone, vanishing into the rocks where, Clara now realized, she must have a second entrance to her den. Somewhere up there, her kittens waited, safe from both fire and humans. Tobin watched her go, then pressed against Clara's leg with a contented sigh. They were alive, thanks to an alliance that defied every natural law, a wild predator choosing to protect those who had tried to protect her. June finally raised her camera, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed the images she'd managed to capture. "No one's going to believe this," she said. Clara touched the scratch on her arm where a burning branch had caught her. "They'll have to believe it," she said. "Because this isn't over. Rex went too far this time. He nearly killed us all." The fire trucks were getting closer, and Clara could hear Harlan's voice calling for them. She gathered Tobin in her arms, holding him close as she thought about the bobcat, now hidden away with her own babies. Today had changed everything, not just the balance of power with Rex, but something deeper about how humans and wildlife could coexist. They waded across the creek toward Harlan's voice, leaving behind the smoking forest and taking with them an extraordinary tale of survival and unexpected allies. The morning after the fire, Clara's kitchen became their command center. June spread photographs across the worn wooden table while Harlan organized land documents into neat stacks. Clara nursed her bandaged arm, watching as Tobin dozed near the back door, his own minor injuries carefully treated. "These photos are irrefutable," Harlan said, holding up one of June's shots showing Rex's men setting the fire. "Combined with the land surveys and falsified documents, we've got him dead to rights." Clara leaned forward, wincing as her burns protested. "But we need to move fast. Rex won't stay quiet after last night's failure." As if summoned by her words, the rumble of vehicles approached her clinic. Through the window, they watched 3 of Rex's trucks pull up, men piling out with rifles. "June, get the camera ready," Clara said quietly. "Harlan." The retired game warden was already on his phone. "Sheriff Barnes?" "Yeah, it's happening exactly like we discussed. Better get here quick." Clara stepped onto her front porch, Tobin at her heels. Rex emerged from the lead truck, his face twisted with rage and determination. "You've interfered for the last time, Clara," he spat. "That cat's going down today, and there's nothing you can do about it." "Actually," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, "there's quite a lot I can do." She held up a thick manila envelope. "Like sharing these land records showing how you've illegally seized protected forest land, or these photos of your men setting a fire that nearly killed 3 people. Rex's face reddened. "You're bluffing. Want to bet your empire on that?" Harlan stepped up beside Clara, his presence commanding respect even in retirement. "I've got 30 years of watching you break laws, Rex. Should have known you'd finally go too far." The sound of sirens cut through the tension. 2 sheriff's vehicles appeared on the road, followed by state police cars and a Forest Service truck. Rex's men shifted nervously, several lowering their rifles. "Don't you dare move!" Rex snarled at them, but his authority was already crumbling. Sheriff Barnes stepped out of his vehicle, followed by 2 state police officers. "Mr. Holloway," he called out, "I've got some serious questions about that fire last night." "This is private property business." Rex blustered, but his voice had lost its edge. "Not according to these records," one of the state officers said, accepting the manila envelope from Clara. He began laying out documents on the hood of his car. "These boundaries were illegally altered. You've been hunting on protected land." June emerged from the clinic, her camera clicking steadily as she documented everything. Rex's men began backing away, creating distance between themselves and their boss. "You can't prove anything," Rex said, but his eyes darted between the officers now surrounding him. "Actually," Clara said softly, "we can prove everything." She nodded to June, who held up her camera. "Every illegal trap, every falsified document, and especially that fire you ordered set." The sheriff stepped forward with handcuffs. "Rex Holloway, you're under arrest for multiple violations of state land use laws, endangering human life, and attempted destruction of protected habitat." As the cuffs clicked shut, a movement caught Clara's eye. At the forest's edge, the Bobcat stood watching, her tawny coat gleaming in the morning sun. Tobin wagged his tail once but stayed by Clara's side. The wildcat's gaze seemed to meet Clara's for a moment before she turned, disappearing into the shadows where her kittens waited. The arrest scene unfolded like a complex dance. State officers interviewed Rex's former men, who quickly turned on their boss to save themselves. Forest Service officials pored over the land records, their faces grim as they documented years of environmental violations. Through it all, June kept photographing, creating an undeniable record of Rex's downfall. "Never thought I'd see this day," Harlan murmured, watching Rex being led to a police car. Man acted like he owned the whole county for so long. Clara touched her bandaged arm, remembering the fear and heat of the fire. "He forgot that some things can't be owned," she said. The wild belongs to itself. The morning stretched into afternoon as statements were taken and evidence catalogued. Rex's men surrendered their illegal traps and ammunition, marking locations on maps where they'd encroached on protected land. Through it all, Clara kept glancing towards the forest, but the Bobcat didn't appear again. Finally, the vehicles began pulling away. Rex's trucks were impounded, his empire crumbling in the space of a single morning. Sheriff Barnes approached Clara one last time. "You did good work here," he said, looking somewhat shamefaced. "Should have listened to your concerns sooner." Clara nodded, accepting the belated acknowledgement. What matters is that it's done now. The forest is protected again. As the last officials departed, Clara, June, and Harlan stood on the porch, watching dust settle on the road. Tobin sat at Clara's feet, his usual restless energy calm for once. "So what happens now?" June asked, reviewing the images on her camera. Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Now, we let the wild be wild. The Bobcat has her kittens to raise, and we have a clinic to run." Harlan chuckled. "And I've got a lot of boundaries to help restore. Rex's mess will take some time to clean up properly." They watched the sun angle toward afternoon, the forest breathing its ancient rhythm behind them. Somewhere in those shadows, a mother bobcat tended her kittens, free now from human persecution. The boundary between wild and tame remained, but perhaps a little less rigid than before. The autumn sunlight streamed through Clara's clinic windows, warming the examination table where Tobin lay patiently as she changed his bandages. His wounds from the steel trap were healing well, though she suspected he'd always have a slight limp in his right front paw. It didn't seem to dampen his spirit one bit. "You're being unusually cooperative today," Clara murmured, smoothing fresh gauze over his leg. From the waiting room came the sound of June's laughter as she chatted with a client about their new kitten. 3 weeks had passed since Rex's arrest, and life had settled into a new rhythm. June's parents, after much discussion, had agreed to let her finish her senior year living with Clara. "She's found her place there," her mother had admitted during their last phone call. "I haven't heard her this happy in years." Tobin's tail thumped against the metal table as Clara finished securing the bandage. "All done, brave boy." She helped him down, watching as he made his way to the clinic's back door. Even with his injury, he still insisted on his daily patrol of the property's edge, where the yard met the forest. "Want company?" June appeared in the doorway, her camera hanging from its usual spot around her neck. Several of her photos from Rex's arrest had made the local paper, launching what she now called her serious photography career. Clara nodded, grabbing her coffee mug. "Let's take a break. Mrs. Peterson isn't due with her sheep for another hour." They followed Tobin outside, settling on the wooden bench Clara's late husband had built years ago. The forest stretched before them, its leaves beginning to turn gold and crimson. Somewhere in those depths, the Bobcat was raising her kittens, though they rarely caught glimpses of her now. "Do you think he misses her?" June asked, watching Tobin nose along the tree line. "The Bobcat, I mean." Clara considered this, warming her hands around her mug. "I think he understands better than we do. He knows he belongs to both worlds now, wild and tame." "Like me," June said softly. When Clara turned to look at her, the girl was smiling. "I mean, I was so lost before, trying to figure out where I fit. But helping save the forest, documenting everything that happened, it showed me I could make a difference." Clara reached out and squeezed her niece's hand. "You made all the difference. Your photos were what convinced the authorities to take action." "We all did it together," June corrected, raising her camera to capture Tobin's silhouette against the autumn trees. "That's what I learned here. How to be part of something bigger than myself." Tobin returned to them, pressing against Clara's legs before flopping down at their feet. His mismatched paws stretched out in the sunshine, the bandaged one held slightly apart. "The physical therapist says he's doing really well," Clara said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Another few weeks and we can probably stop the therapy sessions." "Good thing you're a vet," June teased. "Your insurance would never cover doggy PT." They shared a laugh, and Clara marveled at how natural it felt now, this easy affection between them. The lonely silence that had filled her life after Tom's death had been replaced by June's teenage energy, Tobin's devoted presence, and a renewed sense of purpose. A movement at the forest's edge caught their attention. The bobcat appeared briefly, her powerful form pausing in a shaft of sunlight. Tobin lifted his head but made no move to follow her. Instead, he watched with what Clara could have sworn was contentment as the wild cat disappeared back into her domain. "She still checks on him," June whispered, lowering her camera after capturing the moment. "Like she knows he's family, just different family now." Clara nodded, feeling a familiar tightness in her throat. "That's what we all are, isn't it? Different kinds of family, brought together by this place, this fight." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light softened. A cool breeze carried the scent of approaching winter, but Clara felt only warmth. Her clinic was thriving, with more local farmers bringing their livestock now that Rex's influence was gone. June's presence had brought new energy to the practice. She was already talking about veterinary school after graduation. Tobin stirred at their feet, rolling over for a belly rub that Clara happily provided. His fierce loyalty during the conflict with Rex had transformed into a gentle guardianship of their expanded family. He still had his wild streak, but it was tempered now by devotion. "Aunt Clara?" June's voice was thoughtful. "Remember when you told me some things can't be owned? I think I finally understand what you meant." Clara looked at her niece's face, seeing the wisdom that had replaced teenage rebellion. "Oh? The forest, the bobcat, even love, they're not things we can control. We just get to be part of their story for a while. Make it better if we can." "That's exactly right," Clara said softly, pride swelling in her heart. "And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they become part of our story too." The clinic's phone rang inside, calling them back to work. As they stood, Tobin scrambled up, ready to follow. His limp was barely noticeable now, his resilience a daily reminder of why they had fought so hard. Clara paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. June with her camera, Tobin at her side, the forest standing tall beyond them. The loneliness that had once defined her life had been replaced by something richer, a tapestry of connections, wild and tame, each thread strengthening the whole. "Come on," she said, holding the door open. "Let's see what the rest of the day brings." Tobin trotted through first, ever the faithful guardian, while June paused to capture one last photo of the autumn light on the trees. Clara followed them inside, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. An unlikely family, bound by love, loyalty, and the wild heart that beat in all of them. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.